Chapter 2. The Chennault Affair, October 30th, 1968, 10:25 a.m. The President's little office. President Lyndon B. Johnson had a problem unlike any he'd ever faced. For guidance, he turned to the last of his three great mentors. All were giants of Democratic politics. The first two were President Franklin D. Roosevelt and House Speaker Sam Rayburn, a fellow Texan. The third was Senator Richard B. Russell of Georgia. Johnson valued Russell's judgment above all others. But on the two issues that dominated his legacy as president, civil rights and Vietnam, LBJ had defied his counsel.
In this job, a man must set a standard to which he's working. In my case, it is what will my grandchildren think when I'm buried out there under the tree on the ranch. I think they will be proud of two things: what I did for the Negro and seeing it through in Vietnam for all of Asia. The Negro cost me 15 points in the polls, and Vietnam cost me 20.
Johnson told a New York Times reporter writing about the twilight of his presidency. Russell was the president's public opponent on civil rights and his private counselor on Vietnam. While he acknowledged that Johnson would suffer politically if he didn't fight in Vietnam, Russell told the president in 1964 that this was a war America didn't need to wage.
It isn't important a damn bit.
Other critics emerged as the war went badly, but Russell warned LBJ long before he sent in the 1st Combat Brigade.
I never did want to get messed up down there. I do not agree with those brain trusters who say this thing has tremendous strategic and economic value and that we'll lose everything in Southeast and Asia if we lose Vietnam.
Russell told the president.
I don't think that's true, but I think as a practical matter we're in there, and I don't know how the hell you can tell the American people you're coming out. There's just no way to do it. They'll think that you've just been whipped and you've been run, you're scared, and it'd be disastrous.
The president was on the brink of another Vietnam-related political disaster in October 1968. For months, Hanoi had demanded an unconditional halt to American bombing of North Vietnam before it would discuss any settlement of the war. Johnson, however, insisted that Hanoi meet certain secret military conditions before he would call off the aerial and naval bombardment of the North. Hanoi had finally accepted his demands, but just as LBJ was getting ready to order the bombing halt and announce the start of peace talks, he received a warning. The Republican presidential nominee was trying to sabotage the peace talks before they even began. Faced with an unprecedented problem, he turned, as he had so many times before, to Senator Russell.
Well, I've got one this morning that's pretty rough for you. We have found that our friend, the Republican nominee, our California friend, has been playing on the outskirts with our enemies and our friends both, our allies and the others. He's been doing it through rather subterranean sources here.
The warning came from a source no president could safely ignore. Alexander Sachs, an economist at Wall Street's Lehman Corporation who had helped write campaign speeches for FDR. Sachs entered history when he warned Roosevelt on behalf of Albert Einstein and other leading physicists that Nazi Germany might build an atom bomb. An October 11, 1939 meeting in the Oval Office between FDR and Sachs led to the Manhattan Project. Sachs had a pretty good track record of forecasting trouble.
Among the developments he was credited with having predicted were the 1929 Depression, the 1933 banking crisis, and the rise of Hitler.
The New York Times wrote, like these earlier warnings, the one Sachs gave Johnson concerned matters that could affect the future of America and the world. At an October 28, 1968 working lunch on Wall Street, Sachs had heard from
a member of the banking community, a colleague, a man he has known for many years, and one in whose honesty he has absolute confidence.
that Nixon was approaching the peace talks.
Like another Fortas case.
Conservative senators had successfully filibustered Johnson's nomination of Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas to become Chief Justice earlier that month. Sachs wouldn't reveal the identity of his source, but told Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Eugene V. Rostow what he'd heard.
The speaker said he thought the prospects for a bombing halt or a ceasefire were dim because Nixon was playing the problem as he did the Fortas affair to block. He was taking public positions intended to achieve that end. They would incite Saigon to be difficult and Hanoi to wait. Part of Nixon's strategy is an expectation that an offensive will break out soon, that we will have to spend a great deal more money, and incur more casualties, a fact which would adversely affect the stock market and the bond market. North Vietnamese offensive action was a definite element in the thinking about the future. These difficulties would make it easier for Nixon to settle after January. Like Ike in 1953, he would be able to settle on terms which the president could not accept, blaming the deterioration of the situation between now and January or February on his predecessor.
Mere hours after LBJ got this warning from Sachs, he learned that the South Vietnamese government was indeed going to be difficult. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu had started saying that 3 days between stopping the bombing and starting the peace talks just wasn't enough time for him to get a delegation to Paris.
Didn't he say 1 day originally?
Johnson asked his advisors. The president began to suspect Sachs was right.
The next thing that we got our teeth in was one of his associates, a fellow named Mitchell, who's running his campaign, who's the real Sherman Adams of the operation, in effect said to a businessman that we're going to handle this like we handled the Fortas matter, unquote. We're going to frustrate the president by saying to the South Vietnamese and the Koreans and the Thailanders, beware of Johnson. At the same time, we're going to say to Hanoi, I can make a better deal than he has because I'm fresh and new, and I don't have to demand as much as he does in the light of past positions. Now, when we got that pure by accident, as a result of some of our Wall Street connections, that caused me to look a little deeper.
I guess so.
And I have means of doing that, as you may well imagine.
Yes.
The president didn't spell it out on the telephone, but U.S. intelligence agencies were reporting Saigon's internal discussions of the bombing halt negotiations to him. The NSA was intercepting diplomatic cables from the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington, D.C. to its home government. The CIA had a bug in the office of South Vietnam's president. It took decades for the U.S. government to declassify the CIA and NSA reports. And even then, the intelligence agencies redacted many passages with thick black markers. So heavily censored are the public versions of these reports that they do not include the next name Johnson mentioned, the central figure in what came to be known as the Chennault affair.
And Mrs. Chennault is contacting their ambassador from time to time. Seems to be kind of the go-between.
Anna Chan Chennault was the widow of Lieutenant General Claire Chennault, the American leader of a volunteer air group, the Flying Tigers, that defended China against Japanese invaders in World War II. It was then that he met Chen Xiangmei, Plum Blossom, a beautiful young war correspondent. Once the war was over, Chennault divorced his American wife of 34 years. In 1947, he married Chen Xiangmei, now Anna Chan, in Shanghai. He was 57. The press couldn't determine her age, 22. The Chennaults planned to live in China, where they ran a new airline, civil air transport. Mao Zedong's communist revolution disrupted their plans when the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan, while continuing to lay claim to all of China. Cat moved to the island as well. The Chennaults became fixtures of the China lobby, not so much an organization as an alliance of conservative American politicians, activists, and Chinese nationalists. The China lobby blamed President Harry S. Truman and the State Department of the World War II General George C. Marshall and Dean Acheson for losing China. The China lobby never really came up with a way Truman could have saved China from communism, nor did it have to. The rallying cry of "Who lost China?" was effective enough to help Republicans win the House and Senate in the 1950 midterm elections. Politicians tried to make their opponent's name the answer to the question, who lost blank during the Cold War, because the tactic paid off on election day, successfully casting an opponent as the sort who would leave the nation vulnerable to foreign threats due to weakness, failure to grasp the nature of the global challenge, cowardice, short-sighted political opportunism, even disloyalty, won elections. Anna Chennault's narrative of her life story reflected and reinforced such attacks. In her account, Chennault lost her homeland to Mao's revolutionaries because a democratic administration in Washington failed to support Chinese anti-communists. This was a tale Republicans loved to tell. Once Chennault moved to America, she rose rapidly in political circles. In the age of the Washington hostess, Chennault made herself a renowned one, our China doll, in the words of another. for the parties thrown into a penthouse apartment in the capital's new and fashionable Watergate complex. Life magazine sent photographers to shoot her party prep. Chennault rose in business too, as vice president of the Flying Tiger Line, founded by her late husband's World War II comrades, and then the biggest freight airline on the planet. Chennault assembled a dazzling network of social, business, and political connections. With former First Lady Mamie Eisenhower, Chennault served as co-chair of the Women's Advisory Committee for the Nixon campaign. She was the only Chinese-American woman to attend the 1968 GOP convention as a delegate. Chennault raised $250,000 for Nixon, making her his top woman fundraiser. The men of the Johnson administration never knew what to make of her. To them, she was the Dragon Lady, a name drawn not from Asian history or culture, but from an American comic strip, Terry and the Pirates, or the Little Flower, or the Lady, or just the Woman. She was singular.
I know it's her, Mrs. Chennault. You know, of the Flying Tigers.
Yes, I know Mrs. Chennault.
She's young and attractive. I mean, she's a pretty good-looking girl.
She certainly is.
And she's around town, and she is warning them to not get pulled in on this Johnson move.
The president had a great deal of information from the NSA intercepts and the CIA bug, but he was missing the central piece of the puzzle. One of his speechwriters, without realizing how important it was, kept the following memo from the foreign policy advisor Richard V. Allen to Nixon, referred to within the campaign as DC. July 3rd, 1968.
Regarding possible meeting with South Vietnamese ambassador. Talked with Mrs. Chennault, who is longtime friend of Saigon's ambassador to the U.S., Boy Diem. He is now in Paris, designated official observer and representative of SVN government to the peace talks. He is due back in here, Washington, next week sometime. Mrs. Chennault has apparently asked him if he would talk to D.C. I explained schedule tight, but possible to check on available time. Meeting would have to be absolute top secret, etc. Initiative is ours. If D.C. can see him, I am to contact Mrs. Chennault. She will arrange.
Near the words, top secret, Nixon scribbled.
Should be, but I don't see how with the Secret Service.
Secret Service agents provided Nixon protection as a candidate, but their boss was President Johnson.
If it can be secret, RN would like to see.
The candidate wrote, referring to himself by his initials. The speechwriter who kept the memo thought the meeting hadn't taken place. The meeting had taken place, however. Nixon had managed to keep it secret. On July 12, 1968, Chennault and South Vietnamese Ambassador Boy Diem flew from Washington, D.C. to New York City, where the Nixon campaign was headquartered, for a meeting with the candidate and his campaign chairman, John Mitchell. Chennault revealed this years after the fact in her 1980 memoir, The Education of Anna. Ambassador Diem provides a corroborating account of the meeting in his own memoir, 1987's In the Jaws of History. Chennault introduced Nixon to the South Vietnamese ambassador for the first time. Nixon designated her as
the sole representative between the Vietnamese government and the Nixon campaign headquarters.
Chennault wrote. She quoted the candidate as saying,
Anna is my good friend. She knows all about Asia. I know you also consider her a friend, so please rely on her from now on as the only contact between myself and your government. If you have any message for me, please give it to Anna, and she will relay it to me, and I will do the same in the future. We know Anna is a good American and a dedicated Republican. We can all rely on her loyalty.
So when President Johnson told Senator Russell that,
Mrs. Chennault is contacting their ambassador from time to time. Seems to be kind of the go-between.
he was more right than he knew.
In addition, their ambassador is saying to Tew that Johnson is desperate and is just moving heaven and earth to elect Humphrey, so don't you get sucked in on that. He is kind of these folks' agents here, this little South Vietnamese ambassador. Now, this is not guesswork.
CIA reports on the bug in Tew's office indicated the South Vietnamese president thought Johnson was calling the bombing halt to help Vice President Humphrey win the election. Humphrey wasn't Tew's candidate. Within the Johnson administration, Humphrey had opposed LBJ's decision in 1965 to escalate and Americanize the Vietnam War. Nixon, America's premier anti-communist politician of the Cold War, had called for increased American intervention. Tew realized that his own actions could influence the American presidential election and shape South Vietnam's future. If it became clear that the South Vietnamese government didn't agree with LBJ's bombing halt deal, Tew said,
That would be to the advantage of candidate Nixon.
We don't think they're going to come in the light of the Nixon thing.
I'm surprised that Nixon, I never did have any confidence in him, but damn if I thought he'd stoop to anything like that.
Well, it may be his agents.
For months, Johnson had gone to extraordinary lengths to secure Nixon's support for the U.S. negotiating position, when Nixon was just the front runner in the Republican race prior to winning the GOP nomination, still fending off challenges from Republican California Governor Ronald Reagan on his right and Republican New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller on his left. He received an invitation to the White House for a personal briefing from the president.
He says he is for our position in Vietnam. He thinks Democrats will go the other way.
LBJ had told his advisors the president feared Nixon was right.
The GOP may be of more help to us than the Democrats in the last few months.
The public knew that the president had launched a new initiative to seek an honorable peace. The same night, he revealed his decision not to run for re-election.
Tonight, I have ordered our aircraft and our naval vessels to make no attacks on North Vietnam, except in the area north of the demilitarized zone, where the continuing enemy buildup directly threatens Allied forward positions and where the movements of their troops and supplies are clearly related to that threat. The area in which we are stopping our attacks includes almost 90% of North Vietnam's population and most of its territory. There will be no attacks around the principal populated areas or in the food-producing areas of North Vietnam. Even this very limited bombing of the North could come to an early end if our restraint is matched by restraint in Hanoi. But I cannot in good conscience stop all bombing so long as to do so would immediately and directly endanger the lives of our men and our allies. Whether a complete bombing halt becomes possible in the future will be determined by events.
Johnson offered to stop the bombing of North Vietnam altogether if it would lead to prompt, productive peace talks. What that meant in practical terms wasn't exactly clear to the public. The ambiguity was purposeful. Hanoi demanded an unconditional bombing halt, and Johnson had conditions. If he made them public, his peace initiative would be dead on arrival, so they remained secret. But the president did reveal them to the likely nominee of the opposition party. It was a calculated risk. Politicians were debating whether to stop the bombing. If Nixon or any candidate said he would stop it unconditionally, the North Vietnamese might just sit on their hands until after the election, hoping for a better deal from Johnson's successor. They might do that, even if the candidate offered only slightly better terms in public than Johnson's negotiators were demanding in secret. LBJ took the candidates into his confidence to keep them from undercutting him. He was not about to let them destroy any hope of accomplishing the goal. He set out in a speech that used the word peace 31 times. Johnson might have been a lame duck, but he was still president. He got the blame for dragging America into Lyndon Johnson's war. He wanted the credit for starting peace talks to get it out. Sitting across the cabinet room table from the Republican frontrunner on July 26th, Johnson laid out his secret terms. American negotiators in Paris had told the North Vietnamese that the United States would stop the bombing only if Hanoi
1. Respects the demilitarized zone dividing North Vietnam from the South.
The trade-off was obvious. Johnson was still bombing the area directly north of the demilitarized zone, DMZ, because that was one place where Hanoi amassed troops and trucks before infiltrating them into the south. The bombing didn't stop infiltration, but did slow it down. Unless Hanoi respected the DMZ, a bombing halt would allow it to move more soldiers and supplies into the south, endangering the lives of American soldiers.
2. Stop shelling South Vietnamese cities.
The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were using mortar and rocket fire to terrorize civilians.
3. Enters peace talks with Saigon.
The only participants in the Paris talks at this point were the Americans and North Vietnamese. Hanoi refused to discuss any topic other than an unconditional U.S. bombing halt. Johnson insisted on full-fledged peace talks that included the South Vietnamese. In return, he was willing to let Hanoi bring the National Liberation Front, NLF, the Viet Cong's political wing, to the bargaining table as well. Johnson's negotiators didn't call these conditions in the Paris talks, since Hanoi maintained its position that the United States had to stop the bombing without reciprocity of any kind. The administration came up with creative synonyms for conditions such as understandings and facts of life, as in, it was simply a fact of life that Johnson would have to end any bombing halt if the North Vietnamese crossed the DMZ. Privately, though, Johnson calls them conditions. Richard Nixon had no objections to any of them. The more conditions Johnson set, the less likely Hanoi was to accept them. That suited Nixon fine. Johnson's approval ratings had skyrocketed after he announced the end to most American bombing of the North in March. A complete bombing halt combined with the start of peace talks would help Nixon's most likely Democratic opponent, Vice President Humphrey. Nixon was against a bombing halt, although he didn't tell the president or the voters.
I understand that Hubert is under tremendous pressure.
Nixon said. The chief remaining anti-war Democrat in the race following Robert Kennedy's murder, Minnesota Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy, was calling for a bombing halt. Robert F. Kennedy had announced his support for one the day he launched his candidacy. Humphrey's liberal base was largely for a halt as a way to get negotiations started.
I think he'll have to come up with a bombing pause.
Nixon said. Johnson said he didn't think so. He'd spoken with the vice president the night before and said a bombing halt would be absolutely ridiculous. The president didn't mention that he'd threatened to repudiate his vice president if Humphrey crossed him on this issue.
In fact, he told me that it would endanger American troops like his son-in-law and cost lives. I would have their blood on my hands.
Humphrey told a political advisor after the meeting.
He would denounce me publicly for playing politics with peace.
Johnson made it a point of pride and strict policy to give Humphrey's opponents the same information he gave his own vice president. The same day he had Nixon to the White House, Johnson also personally briefed a right-wing third-party candidate. George C. Wallace had made a national name for himself by declaring his support of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, in his 1963 inaugural address as governor of Alabama, and had since developed a national following on the political right. Wallace positioned himself as the conservative alternative to both major parties, and the Gallup poll showed his support among registered voters at 16%. The late 1960s was a time of both large-scale anti-war demonstrations and the rise of the political right. In part, the former fueled the latter. Wallace rallies applauded his line about the demonstrator who had once lain down in front of LBJ's limousine.
I'll tell you this, if I were president and anyone lay down in front of my car, that'd be the last car he would lay down in front of.
The left was gaining a lot of attention. The right was gaining votes. Regarding the bombing halt, Wallace expressed as much support for LBJ as Nixon did. The president's negotiating position was a hawkish one. Secretary of State Dean Rusk and National Security Advisor Walt Rostow joined LBJ in the cabinet room for the July 26 Nixon briefing. Outwardly, the secretary and the advisor had little in common. Rusk was the son of a rural Georgia preacher. Rostow, the son of a Russian Jewish immigrant to New York City. Rusk spoke in a slow, easy drawl. JFK complained that Rostow wrote memos faster than he could read them. Rusk's parents were Calvinists and Rostow's socialists, but both men were hardline anti-communists, Johnson's top two civilian hawks on Vietnam. Nixon especially admired Rusk, privately deeming him
A tower of strength.
The Secretary of State gave his international perspective on the talks. The bombing of North Vietnam was
The principal interest of the Soviet Union,
as well as the United States at the moment. At this point, however, the Soviets couldn't tell President Johnson what Hanoi would do if he ordered a halt. Moscow was nervous about pressing the North Vietnamese on the issue for fear that would drive them into the arms of China, its own rival for leadership in the communist world, Rusk said. He claimed Hanoi had hurt itself in international opinion by continuing rocket attacks on Saigon. It was hard to generate indignation at the American bombing of military targets in the north, while its soldiers were firing explosives at civilians in the south. Nixon questioned them regarding
The whole jazz about a coalition government.
one in which communists and anti-communists would formally share power. Rostow said everyone in South Vietnam viewed a coalition government as a way for the communists to take over. Saigon was dead set against it. On the other hand, he said, the South Vietnamese would allow the communists to compete in elections.
My best judgment is that we're not losing the war, we're winning it, and we're very close to winning it.
I certainly don't buy the idea that the war is lost. I assume you would have told me if it was.
After the briefing ended, Nixon talked with reporters on the West Wing steps. He called Johnson's briefing
Candid and forthright.
These were valuable words for a president suffering from what the newspapers called a credibility gap. Nixon told reporters that
The President and Secretary of State spoke to me straight from the shoulder.
He gave them no details of the classified briefing, other than to say it covered the Paris negotiations on Vietnam and that.
I will not say anything to jeopardize the chances for a settlement.
Right before the Republican convention in August, Nixon outlined a position on Vietnam that appeared to justify LBJ's confidence. The Republican frontrunner made a virtue of a candidate's silence on the central issue of the campaign.
Anything he might offer as a candidate would become unavailable for bargaining when he became president. Anything he might say, any differences he might express, would be taken by Hanoi as indicating the possible new direction of the next administration. Our negotiators in Paris represent not only the present administration, but the United States, in the spirit of country above party, as long as they have a chance of success. And as long as the administration remains committed to an honorable settlement, they should be free from partisan interference, and they should have our full support. The pursuit of peace is too important for politics as usual.
This was exactly what Johnson wanted to hear. It left the negotiations firmly in his hands. Publicly, Nixon respected his constitutional role.
The present administration's emissaries in Paris must be able to speak with the full force and authority of the United States. Nothing should be offered in the political arena that might undercut their hand.
As for what he would do if elected, Nixon said it was time to seek a negotiated settlement. He warned this would require patience. In the meantime, he promised to wage the war more effectively.
But rather than further escalation on the military front, what it requires now is a dramatic escalation of our efforts on the economic, political, diplomatic, and psychological fronts.
It also required training and equipping the South Vietnamese to play a greater role in their own defense.
As they are phased in, American troops can and should be phased out.
General Creighton Abrams and the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, were already making a push to train and equip Saigon's army.
However cruel its military aspects, this new kind of war is not primarily a military struggle in the conventional sense. It is primarily a political struggle, with the enemy conducting military operations to achieve political and psychological objectives. It is a war for people, not for territory. The real measure of progress is not the body count of enemy killed, but the number of South Vietnamese won to the building and defense of their own country. This new kind of war requires greater emphasis on small unit action, on rooting out the Viet Cong infrastructure, on police and patrol activities, on intelligence gathering, on the strengthening of local forces. This kind of war can actually be waged more effectively with fewer men and at less cost.
As president, Nixon would learn the limits of these tactics. During the campaign, however, his statement offered voters the hope of leaving Vietnam without losing the war. When the 1968 Republican Convention nominated him for president and Governor Spiro T. Agnew of Maryland for vice president, Richard Nixon got a call from the White House before he even delivered his acceptance speech.
Dick, I want to keep in close touch with you along the line we did
Wonderful.
in our last talk, and I want to try to play this thing as much in the national interest as is humanly possible, and as fair as possible, and I have just one purpose, and that is the best interests of the country. And I believe that your conduct has been very responsible.
Well,
There are some developments that have not changed the picture, but that I think you would do well to know about.
The president invited the Republican nominee and his running mate to the LBJ Ranch for another briefing once the GOP convention ended. Johnson would have Ambassador Cyrus Arvaz, Chief Negotiator W. Averell Harriman's deputy, fly from Washington to Texas for the briefing before he headed back to Paris for another round of discussions with the North Vietnamese. Secretary of State Rusk, Nixon's favorite Johnson administration official, would be there too. LBJ mentioned that Humphrey was visiting the next day, but not that the vice president had requested the meeting just a few hours earlier. The president said he was under great pressures but wasn't going to succumb.
I appreciate very much your attitude on the whole picture.
Johnson said. He offered the Republicans lunch.
And I got a note this morning. My son-in-law's company had 220 and is down to half strength, and he lost. Had 30 wounded yesterday.
incidentally, I thought you should know that Agnew, my running mate, the guy I selected, he has a boy that's been there for 5 months
Well, I'll be damned.
in Vietnam, so we both got a good interest in that.
Well,
And my nephew's out there, so we're all looking for the same.
we're both supposed to be great political animals, but we both want to do what's best for our country, And I think it's awfully important dealing with these commies for the next 4 months for us to be completely informed with the same facts, and then we can do whatever our judgment dictates.
Nixon's acceptance speech included a reassuring line.
We all hope in this room that there's a chance that current negotiations may bring an honorable end to that war, and we will say nothing during this campaign that might destroy that chance.
The next morning, when reporters questioned the nominee about the phone call from the president, Nixon promised again not to undercut the negotiations.
I told him that that will be the policy of the party. It will be the policy of the candidates between now and the election, but that we have to be kept briefed on developments and that we can't be in a position where the ground is cut out from under us. He said, it's vitally important that on this issue, that as long as these negotiations go on, that we have a united front at home on those negotiations, and I'm going to play it straight down the middle with regard to intelligence on what is going on in Vietnam. I take the president at his word, and I think that it will serve not only our interests, but more important, it'll serve the interests of the country.
In full view of the TV cameras, Nixon sat down at the hotel piano, noting that Home on the Range was the favorite song of Johnson's favorite president, FDR, and that the title captured where the president would soon be.
Unless he changes his mind.
The nominee played and sang it at full blast. While Nixon was giving every appearance of supporting Johnson's negotiating position, Humphrey was at the LBJ ranch showing the president a draft campaign speech calling for a bombing halt. His campaign had struggled to craft a statement Johnson would accept. This was draft number 11. LBJ talked him out of it once more. For the following day's visit from Nixon and Agnew, LBJ produced CIA Director Richard Helms along with Ambassador Vance and Secretary Rusk.
What about Thew's attitude? He did not object to the Viet Cong being at negotiations.
We and the South Vietnamese would be at the table on an our side, your side basis. Thieu himself proposed the our side, your side formula. Our side can bring anyone it wants, including Saigon's representatives, and the North Vietnamese can bring anyone it wants, including the NLF. Officially, neither Saigon nor the NLF will participate as a separate delegation. At the bargaining table will just be our side and your side.
It was a semantic solution to a diplomatic problem. The NLF, however, wanted to be a separate delegation from Hanoi. The United States rejected that idea.
They have no problem making their views known.
Neither did he. Johnson spent the rest of August using any means at his disposal to make sure the upcoming Democratic Convention in Chicago didn't undercut his negotiating position either. It was tricky since officially the White House denied that the president was playing any role in the convention at all. When McCarthy proposed that the party platform urged the next president to immediately halt the bombing of North Vietnam and negotiate a coalition government with the NLF in the South, Johnson called Nixon the next day with talking points from Secretary Rusk to use against the Democratic candidate.
He's in a fighting mood, and you may wish to unleash him at the right time. That's what the comment from my office said. 1. Some comments on the McCarthy platform should be found in the draft speech. Is this platform being submitted as an ultimatum to the platform committee? Adopt it or accept a floor fight? What ultimatum have the proponents in mind? Surrender to us on Vietnam or we will bolt the party. Is not all this contempt? Why do the proponents not say what they mean? For example, instead of saying, halt the bombing of North Vietnam, why don't they say you should stop bombing men in arms? Now listen to this. Why don't, instead of saying halt the bombing of North Vietnam, you can take this if you want to. I think it's a good phrase.
I'll jot it down.
Why don't they say you should stop bombing men in arms moving southward across the DMZ to kill U.S. and Allied forces? Now that's what it means, Dick.
That's the crux of the matter.
That's all. That's in one sentence.
At 11:22 p.m. on August 20th, Nixon got an urgent call from the White House. The president informed him that Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces had invaded Czechoslovakia. Nixon said the invasion gave the president a stronger hand in the Vietnam negotiations.
Let me ask you this. Can you keep, just talking very candidly, can you keep your vice president and others to keep them firm on this thing? Because you know, the hell with the goddamn election. We must all stand firm on this.
Very frankly, I don't know. That's the honest answer.
Well, I stand firm.
I told Humphrey and the Democrats that if they didn't stand firm, you would murder them.
That's true, I would.
You can be proud of your party's platform on Vietnam.
After hanging up, Johnson spent the next 3.5 hours with Humphrey in the Oval Office, trying to secure the vice president's commitment not to weaken the administration's position on the bombing halt. The meeting went until 3:10 a.m. Before Humphrey flew to Chicago, he publicly declared that Hanoi was not going to get a better deal out of me than from the current president. But on the day the Democratic Convention began, the president was on the phone to Chicago threatening to denounce the party's policy statement if it contained compromise language that Humphrey backed.
Stop all bombing of North Vietnam unless this action would endanger the lives of our troops.
Stopping the bombing would endanger the troops, Johnson told the chairman of the platform writing committee through intermediaries. The White House was still pretending LBJ was above it all. The president dictated the only words he would accept.
Stop all the bombing of North Vietnam when this action would not endanger the lives of our troops in the field. This action should take into account the response from Hanoi.
Humphrey yielded. The alternative for him once again was public denunciation by the president himself. It took a bitter floor fight with the Doves, but Johnson won by a vote of 1,567 3/4 to 1,041 1/4. It was one of the prices Humphrey paid for the presidential nomination. Once he had it, though, Humphrey started edging away from LBJ.
If there is any one lesson that we should have learned, it is that the policies of tomorrow need not be limited by the policies of yesterday. My fellow Americans, if it becomes my high honor to serve as president of these states and people, I shall apply that lesson to the search for peace in Vietnam as to all other areas of national policy.
Humphrey said in his acceptance speech.
Hubert Hint's shift on Viet.
As the Chicago Tribune put it, Humphrey started out far behind. The next Gallup poll showed Nixon leading by 12 points.